After 4 years together, my fiancé said I wasn't worthy of marriage. But the reaction I had finished him off. I never thought I'd be the type to write a post like this, but here we are. If you had told me 3 years ago that my life would take such a turn, I would have laughed. Back then, I was blissfully in love with Elliot, the man I truly believed was my soulmate. We fit together so perfectly, sharing the same love for indie films, spontaneous road trips, and making fun of bad reality TV. Every moment with him felt easy, like we were two pieces of the same puzzle finally clicking into place. He had this way of making me feel special, like I was the most interesting person in any room. We could talk for hours about the most random things. Why cereal tastes better at night, whether we'd survive a zombie apocalypse, what we'd name our imaginary dog. He paid attention to the smallest details, remembering my coffee order down to the amount of sugar. When he laughed, really laughed, it was this deep, uninhibited sound that made everything feel lighter. I used to think I could listen to it forever. After a 1.5 years together, he asked me to move in. It felt like the most natural step in the world, but my parents hesitated. My mom said something about how perfect he seemed, how real love has rough edges. My dad just asked if I was sure, but I waved off their concerns. They didn't know Elliot like I did. We moved into a tiny apartment, where we burned our first dinner together and stayed up all night painting the walls a color that looked way better in the store than it did in real life. It was messy and chaotic, but it was ours. Elliot was never the grand romantic gesture type, but that was fine with me. He showed his love in smaller ways, leaving notes in my lunch, holding my hand when I least expected it, memorizing my favorite songs. I didn't need flashy declarations. I just needed him. And for a long time I thought that was enough. On our 3rd anniversary, he surprised me with a trip to this quiet lake we used to visit when we first started dating. The water was still, the air crisp, and just as the sun dipped below the trees, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. "I can't imagine my life without you," he said, his voice full of certainty. My hands shook as he slid the ring onto my finger. It wasn't flashy, but it was perfect, just like us. From that moment on, everything became about the wedding. I threw myself into planning, pinning inspiration boards, visiting venues, and searching for the perfect dress. Elliot wasn't too involved, but I didn't mind. He said he trusted my taste completely. My friends envied me, calling me the lucky one. And honestly, I believed them. How could I not? I had the love of my life, a beautiful ring, and a future that seemed straight out of a romance movie. Looking back, I wonder if I was too caught up in the fantasy to see the reality. There were little moments, fleeting ones, that should have made me pause. A flicker of impatience in his eyes when I rambled too long about something silly. The way he sometimes corrected me in front of others like I had said something embarrassing. But I dismissed those thoughts as overthinking. After all, no relationship is perfect, right? I told myself that love was about compromise, about growing together. If he ever seemed a little distant, I chalked it up to stress. If he made an offhand comment that stung, I told myself I was being sensitive. I had spent so long believing in the story of us that I refused to see any other version. I was sure we were unbreakable. But here's the thing about love stories. The credits roll before you see what happens after, happily ever after. And if I had looked closer, maybe I would have noticed the cracks forming beneath the surface. Because slowly, almost imperceptibly, things began to change. Didn't happen all at once. If it had, maybe I would have noticed sooner. Instead, it was like a slow leak, small enough to ignore at first, easy enough to dismiss as nothing. It started about 6 months after the engagement, when Elliot's comments began shifting in tone. Not outright cruel, not yet. Just different. A slight edge. A subtle weight that hadn't been there before. First, it was about little things. "You're really wearing that?" he asked one night before a dinner with his colleagues. I laughed, thinking he was joking, but his expression didn't change. "I just think something a little more polished would suit you better." It was the first time I hesitated before walking out the door. The first time I felt a flicker of doubt about myself, about whether I was enough. Then there were the comments about my intelligence. Elliot always used to love my curiosity, my random thoughts about the world. But suddenly I was naive. "You're too trusting," he'd say with a shake of his head, like he was embarrassed for me. Or worse, "You wouldn't understand, it's more of a business thing." I started second-guessing myself in conversations, afraid of sounding foolish. I stopped sharing my thoughts so freely. I also noticed the way he talked about ambition. His, mine, ours. "You have so much potential," he told me once, brushing a strand of hair behind my ear. You just need to refine yourself a little. Think bigger. I wasn't sure what he meant, but I nodded anyway. I wanted to be the person he saw in me, the one he thought I could be. Or more accurately, the one he thought I should be. Then came the comments about my family. "They're sweet," he said once, after we had dinner at my parents' house. "But they're a little, how do I put this? Simple." I laughed at first, thinking he was teasing. But he wasn't. "I just don't think they understand the kind of life we're going to have." It stung in a way I couldn't explain. My parents had always been kind to him, supportive. But suddenly I saw them through his eyes. Less than. Little by little I started changing. Not because he asked me to outright, but because I wanted to make things easier. I swapped out my comfortable clothes for ones I thought he'd approve of. I spoke less in conversations where I used to be the loudest. I started paying more attention to how people viewed me, how I carried myself. And when I looked in the mirror, I wasn't sure I recognized the person staring back. I told myself it was just part of growing up, part of evolving. Relationships change, right? People change. It wasn't like he was being cruel. He was just helping me be my best self. That's what love is, isn't it? Wanting the best for each other. At least that's what I kept telling myself. And then one day, I caught myself hesitating before speaking, choosing my words carefully, like I was afraid to say the wrong thing. Like I was afraid of him. That was the first time I admitted to myself, really admitted, that something felt wrong. But even then, I wasn't ready to face it. Not yet. Because the truth is, I had already given so much of myself to this relationship that I couldn't imagine walking away. Not after everything we had built. Not when the wedding was so close. Not when I had spent years believing he was my forever. I remember the exact moment everything shattered. It was 3 months before the wedding, and I had just found my dress. I stood in front of the mirror at the boutique, running my fingers over the delicate lace, imagining the way Elliot would look at me when I walked down the aisle. I sent him a picture, giddy with excitement. His response came minutes later. "It's nice. Just hope it's not too expected." I stared at my phone, my stomach sinking. Expected. What did that even mean? I tried to brush it off, telling myself he probably meant it in a neutral way. But when I saw him later that night, I asked, "What's wrong with my dress?" I kept my voice light, not wanting to seem defensive. He barely looked up from his laptop. "My mom was just worried you'd pick something predictable." His tone was casual, as if he hadn't just sucker-punched me in the gut. I don't know what it was about that moment. Maybe the months of tiny, cutting remarks had finally built up to something I couldn't ignore. Maybe it was the way he spoke, like I was some project that had gone slightly off course. "Predictable," I repeated, feeling something crack inside me. "What does that even mean?" He sighed, rubbing his temples. "It means I want you to look elegant, sophisticated, not just, the usual." Something in me snapped. "The usual?" I demanded. "I love that dress, Elliot." He rolled his eyes. "You're being dramatic." I was shaking now, but I forced myself to ask the question that had been lurking at the back of my mind for months. "Do you even like me? Or do you just like the idea of me?" The look on his face told me everything I needed to know. But he still answered. "You're making this so difficult," he muttered. "I just think you could be better, more polished, more wife material." I felt the blood drain from my face. "Wife material," echoed. And then he said it, the words that sealed everything. I could be with someone better, Someone who actually fits the life I'm building. The life he was building. As if I was just an accessory. As if I had spent years molding myself into someone who still wasn't enough. My breath caught in my throat, and I stared at him, at the man I had once thought was my forever. And in that moment, the love I had been clinging to, the love I had twisted myself into knots for, started to crumble. I should have screamed at him. I should have thrown something. But all I felt was this heavy, suffocating exhaustion. Because the truth was, this wasn't just about the dress. It was about all of it. The months of biting comments, the way I had shrunk myself down to fit into the box he wanted for me. And for what? For a man who thought I was something to be fixed. I took a deep breath, my hands trembling. I knew in that moment that there was no coming back from this. I had spent years believing we were meant to be. But standing there in front of him, I finally saw the truth. He never really loved me. He loved the version of me that he was trying to create. And I wasn't willing to be her anymore. I opened my mouth to speak, but for the first time, I didn't feel the need to justify myself, to defend, to prove anything. Instead, I just looked at him, really looked at him, and felt something inside me shift. And then I did something neither of us expected. I laughed. Not a bitter, sarcastic laugh. Just a genuine, uncontrollable burst of laughter that bubbled up before I could stop it. The absurdity of it all hit me at once. I had spent years trying to be good enough for a man who had just admitted he could find someone better. I had twisted myself into someone smaller, quieter, less me. And for what? To marry someone who saw me as a project instead of a partner. It was ridiculous. Hilarious, even. Elliot's face twisted in confusion. Then in anger. "What the hell is so funny?" he snapped, his voice sharp. But I couldn't stop. I laughed harder, covering my mouth as I shook my head. "You," I finally managed to say between breaths. "This, all of this." I gestured around the room, as if that somehow encompassed every moment I had spent doubting myself because of him. "You've spent all this time trying to fix me when I was never broken." His jaw clenched. "You're acting crazy." That only made me laugh harder. It was the same thing he always did. Turn my emotions against me, make me feel like I was too much or too little at the same time. But for the first time, I didn't care. I wasn't afraid of his disapproval anymore. It was like I had been holding my breath for years, and suddenly I could finally exhale. Elliot stood up, towering over me, trying to regain control. "You're seriously throwing everything away over this?" he demanded, arms crossed. "Over a dress?" I wiped my eyes, shaking my head. "No, Elliot. I'm not throwing anything away. You did that." His mouth opened, then closed. I could see him scrambling, trying to figure out why his usual tactics weren't working. "I love you," he tried, softening his voice, reaching for my hand. But I pulled away. "No," I said simply. "You love the idea of me. The version of me you built in your head. And I spent so much time trying to be her that I forgot who I actually am." I took a shaky breath, feeling something inside me settle. But I remember now. For the first time since we met, Elliot looked nervous. Maybe because he could feel it too. The shift, the inevitability of what was coming next. "So what, you're just done?" he asked, his voice edged with disbelief. He nodded. "Yeah, I think I am." The words felt foreign but right. Like they had been waiting for me to finally say them. I turned away, walking toward the door. He called my name, but I didn't stop. I grabbed my keys, my phone, and the small overnight bag I had packed for a weekend at my parents' house. I didn't need anything else. Not now. Not ever. As I stepped outside, I took a deep breath of the cool night air. For the first time in years, I felt light, free, whole. And as I walked to my car, one final thought crossed my mind. I had spent so long mourning the idea of losing Elliot. But the truth was, he had lost me long before I ever walked out that door.